Most people walked faster when they saw trouble. She stopped. Rain hammered the streets of Brooklyn with relentless force, turning sidewalks into rivers of reflected neon light and empty parking lots into shimmering pools beneath the storm. The city was still alive despite the weather. Taxi headlights cut through the darkness. Sirens echoed somewhere in the distance. Steam drifted from subway grates and disappeared into the cold night air. Ava Johnson pulled her jacket tighter as she stepped out the back entrance of the diner, where she worked evening shifts 6 days a week. Her black apron was folded neatly under one arm. Her feet ached after 10 straight hours of serving customers, clearing tables, and carrying trays through crowded aisles. All she wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. The clock above the diner door read 11:47 p.m. Most people were already home. Ava started walking toward the bus stop, keeping her head down against the rain. A gust of wind pushed water across the pavement. She took another step and noticed movement in the narrow alley beside an abandoned storefront. At first she assumed it was a stray dog searching for shelter. Then she saw the silhouette of a man. He was leaning against a brick wall beneath a flickering security light. His expensive suit looked completely out of place in that neighborhood. His tie hung loose. His shoulders slumped. Even from a distance, something seemed wrong. Ava slowed her pace. Across the street, 2 pedestrians glanced toward the alley and immediately kept walking. A delivery driver looked over for half a second before climbing into his van and leaving. Nobody stopped. Nobody wanted involvement. That was how cities worked. People learned to mind their own business. Ava should have done the same. She had bills to pay, a small apartment waiting for her, a life already complicated enough without adding a stranger's problems. Yet something about the man made her hesitate. He did not look dangerous. He looked exhausted. The kind of exhausted that went deeper than missing a night of sleep. Another flash of lightning illuminated the alley. For a brief second, Ava saw his face clearly. He seemed disoriented, struggling to stay on his feet while glancing nervously toward the street. Rain soaked his suit jacket. Water dripped from his hair. Whatever had happened before she arrived, it had left him completely drained. Ava looked around. No one else appeared interested in helping. The buses continued passing. Cars rolled through intersections. The city carried on without noticing. She released a long breath and stepped toward the alley. "Sir," she called. The man lifted his head slowly. His eyes met hers for only a moment before he looked away. He seemed unsure whether to trust her. Ava stopped a few feet away. "Are you okay?" she asked. He opened his mouth as if searching for the right words, but said nothing. The silence worried her more than any answer could have. Rain continued pouring around them. The security light buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the city. Ava knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she walked away now, nobody else was coming. And for reasons she could not explain, that thought suddenly felt impossible to ignore. The man looked at Ava as though he was trying to decide whether she was real. Rain continued pouring from the sky, bouncing off the pavement and turning the narrow alley into a maze of shimmering reflections. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he finally nodded once. The movement was small, almost hesitant, but it was enough. Ava stepped closer. Up close, she could see that he was older than she first thought, perhaps in his early 40s. His suit was clearly expensive. Even soaked by the storm, the quality was obvious. Yet nothing about him resembled the confident executives she occasionally served at the diner during lunch hours. His expression carried exhaustion, not ordinary tiredness, something heavier, something that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "Do you need medical help?" Ava asked. The man shook his head immediately. "No," he replied. His voice was calm but strained. "I just need a place to stay for a few hours." Ava studied him carefully. Every lesson she had learned about city life warned her against trusting strangers, especially strangers who appeared out of nowhere near midnight. Her mother used to remind her that kindness should never replace common sense. Yet everything about the situation felt unusual. The man was not asking for money. He was not demanding anything. He simply looked like someone who had reached the end of his strength. A cold gust of wind swept through the alley. The man closed his eyes briefly as though fighting exhaustion. Ava glanced toward the street. A bus passed by. 2 pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas. Nobody paid attention. The city remained indifferent. "Do you have family nearby?" she asked. "Friends." The man hesitated. "Not tonight." Something in his answer made Ava pause. It was not what he said. It was how he said it. As if there were people he could call, but could not risk involving. Before she could ask another question, a distant engine echoed from the far end of the block. The man immediately turned his head toward the sound. His reaction was subtle, but Ava noticed it. The tension in his shoulders. The alertness in his eyes. Whatever had happened before she arrived clearly was not over in his mind. Ava looked back toward her bus stop. She could still walk away. She could pretend she never saw him. Thousands of people made that choice every day. Nobody would blame her. Yet as she stood there in the rain, another thought entered her mind. What if someone she cared about needed help one night, and everyone else chose convenience instead? The answer came faster than she expected. Ava sighed softly. "Come on," she said. The man looked confused. "What? I have a small apartment a few blocks away. You can stay until the weather clears." For the first time, genuine surprise crossed his face. He seemed completely unprepared for the offer. "You do not even know me," he said. Ava shrugged. "That makes two of us." A faint smile appeared on his face before disappearing again. Together they stepped out of the alley and onto the rain-soaked sidewalk. Neither noticed the black sedan slowly turning onto the next street several blocks away. Ava simply focused on getting the stranger somewhere warm. She had no idea that the decision she made in that moment was about to change both of their lives forever. The walk to Ava's apartment took less than 15 minutes, but the storm made it feel much longer. Rain continued pounding the streets as they moved through quiet neighborhoods lit by street lamps and storefront signs. Ava stayed half a step ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure the stranger was still following. He rarely spoke. When he did, his answers remained short, careful, as though every word required consideration. Ava did not push for explanations. She had already decided to help. Whatever story he carried could wait until morning. By the time they reached her building, both were soaked. The apartment complex was old but well-maintained, a red brick structure squeezed between a laundromat and a corner grocery store that never seemed to close. Ava led him up 2 flights of stairs. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint. She unlocked her door and stepped inside. "It is not much," she said. The man entered quietly and looked around. The apartment was small. A modest living room connected to a tiny kitchen. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with novels, biographies, and used textbooks. A framed photograph of Ava and her mother sat on a side table beside an aging lamp. The furniture was simple but clean. Everything had its place. The apartment reflected a life built carefully, one paycheck at a time. For a moment, the stranger simply stood there taking it all in. Ava noticed the way his eyes moved across the room. Not with judgment, with curiosity, almost wonder. "You can sit," she said. "I will find you a towel." She disappeared into the bathroom and returned a minute later carrying clean towels and a spare blanket. The man accepted them with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said. Ava nodded. "There is soup in the refrigerator. It is not fancy, but it is warm." To her surprise, he smiled slightly. "Warm sounds perfect." 20 minutes later, the rain still rattled against the windows while the stranger sat at the small kitchen table eating homemade vegetable soup from a chipped ceramic bowl. Ava watched from across the room. The sight felt oddly familiar. Her mother had always fed people before asking questions. Growing up, Ava had never understood why. Sometimes strangers received help they could barely afford to give. Yet her mother always said the same thing. "Everybody carries a burden you cannot see." Tonight, those words echoed in Ava's mind. The man finished the last spoonful and leaned back slightly. Color had started returning to his face. He looked healthier already, less distant, less guarded. Yet something still troubled him. Ava could see it whenever he thought nobody was watching. The way his gaze drifted toward the window. The way his jaw tightened whenever distant traffic passed outside. Eventually exhaustion won. His eyelids grew heavy. His posture relaxed. Ava prepared the couch with fresh sheets and a blanket. "You should get some sleep," she said. The man looked genuinely surprised by her kindness. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly. Ava considered the question. Then she shrugged. "Because somebody should." The answer seemed to affect him more than she expected. He looked away for a moment before nodding. Minutes later, he was asleep on the couch. Ava dimmed the lights and sat alone at the kitchen table listening to the rain. She still did not know his name. She did not know where he came from. She certainly did not know that the man sleeping a few feet away controlled a business empire worth billions of dollars. To Ava, He was simply a stranger who needed help. And somewhere deep inside, that simple act of kindness had already begun changing something neither of them yet understood. When Ava woke the next morning, sunlight was spilling through the curtains, transforming the tiny apartment into something warmer than it appeared at night. The storm had passed. The city outside had returned to its usual rhythm. Car horns drifted up from the street below. A delivery truck rumbled past the building. Somewhere nearby, a radio played softly through an open window. For a few seconds, Ava forgot she had a stranger sleeping on her couch. Then she noticed the neatly folded blanket resting on the armrest. The couch was empty. A brief moment of concern crossed her mind before she heard movement from the kitchen. She stepped into the hallway and found the man standing beside the window holding a cup of coffee. He looked different in daylight. Healthier. More composed. The exhaustion that had weighed heavily on him the night before had eased. His expensive suit jacket hung neatly over a chair. He had borrowed one of Ava's oversized sweatshirts, making the contrast between his usual world and hers almost impossible to miss. "Good morning," he said. Ava blinked. "You found the coffee." A faint smile appeared on his face. "Your kitchen is small. There are not many places to hide things." Ava laughed despite herself. It was the first genuine laugh she had experienced since meeting him. The sound seemed to surprise both of them. She moved toward the refrigerator and began preparing breakfast. Nothing elaborate. Eggs, toast, and fruit. The same meal she made whenever she had enough groceries to last the week. While she cooked, the stranger watched quietly. There was curiosity in his expression. Not the curiosity of someone judging. The curiosity of someone experiencing something unfamiliar. "Do you always help strangers?" he asked. Ava shrugged. "Not always." "Then why me?" She considered the question while placing plates on the table. "You look like somebody needed help." The answer seemed too simple, yet it was true. The man lowered his eyes for a moment. Most people would have walked away. Ava sat across from him. Most people are carrying their own problems. Silence settled between them for a few seconds. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that appears when people begin understanding each other without needing many words. For the first time, the stranger seemed willing to relax. He looked around the apartment again. The bookshelves. The family photographs. The handwritten notes taped beside the refrigerator. Evidence of an ordinary life built through patience and sacrifice. "You live here alone?" he asked. Ava nodded. "My mother passed away 3 years ago." His expression softened immediately. "I am sorry." "Thank you." She smiled gently. "She taught me most of what matters." The man glanced toward the photograph on the table. "Helping people?" Ava followed his gaze. "Especially helping people." Something changed in his expression then. A shadow of regret. As though her words had touched a place he usually kept hidden. Throughout breakfast, he asked questions about her life. Her job. Her dreams. The books she read. The places she hoped to visit one day. Nobody had ever seemed so interested in such ordinary details. Yet Ava noticed something else. Whenever the conversation shifted toward him, he became careful again. Polite. Reserved. He answered enough to continue talking, but revealed almost nothing. Whatever story he carried remained locked behind a door he was not ready to open. Still, as the morning sunlight filled the room, one thing became increasingly clear. Two people from completely different worlds were sitting across the same table. Neither knew how important that would soon become. The morning slowly turned into afternoon, and neither Ava nor the stranger seemed eager to end the conversation. Outside, Brooklyn moved at its usual pace. People hurried along sidewalks. Delivery trucks stopped at storefronts. Children laughed in a nearby playground. Inside the small apartment, however, time felt strangely different. The stranger remained seated at the kitchen table while Ava prepared for her evening shift at the diner. She ironed her uniform in the living room and organized the notes she used for an online business course she had been taking whenever she could afford the tuition. The stranger noticed the textbooks stacked beside the couch. "Business management?" he asked. Ava nodded. "Eventually." He picked up one of the books and flipped through a few pages. "You want to run a company?" Ava laughed softly. "I would settle for running my own life a little better first." The answer made him smile. It was becoming easier for him to smile around her. Easier to forget the weight he carried beyond the apartment walls. As the afternoon continued, Ava shared more about her life. Not because she wanted sympathy. Because the conversation felt natural. She talked about losing her mother, about working double shifts to keep up with rent, about postponing dreams that never seemed to disappear completely. She spoke about wanting to finish her education and eventually open a community cafe where young people could study, learn, and feel welcome regardless of their circumstances. It was not a billion-dollar dream. It was simply hers. The stranger listened carefully, more carefully than anyone had listened in years. Most people heard pieces of her story. He absorbed every detail, every hope, every disappointment, every small victory she rarely mentioned. At one point, he stood near the bookshelf and examined a photograph of Ava standing beside her mother outside a tiny neighborhood restaurant. Both women were smiling. "She looks proud," he said. Ava walked over and looked at the picture. "She always believed I could do more than I believed myself." The stranger nodded slowly. "That is a rare gift." Something in his voice suggested personal experience. Ava noticed it immediately. "What about you?" she asked. The question lingered between them. The stranger looked toward the window. Sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. For a moment, he seemed far away. "My father believed success solved everything," he said quietly. "I spent a long time trying to prove him right." Ava waited. He offered no further explanation. Yet those few words revealed more than anything he had shared before. Beneath the expensive suit, beneath the careful answers, beneath the mystery, there was loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone. The loneliness of carrying responsibility so long that nobody remembered the person underneath it. As evening approached, Ava prepared to leave for work. The stranger insisted on helping clean the kitchen. She laughed when she saw him struggling to figure out where dishes belonged. The sight felt absurdly normal. Two people from different worlds washing dishes together in a tiny apartment. Yet somehow it worked. Before she left, Ava handed him a spare key. "In case I get home late," she said. The stranger stared at the key resting in his hand. Genuine surprise crossed his face. Trust was not something he received often without conditions attached. Ava did not ask for anything in return. She simply believed people deserved a chance. As the apartment door closed behind her, the stranger stood alone in the quiet room, holding the key. For the first time in many years, someone had offered him kindness without knowing his name, his wealth, or his influence. And somewhere deep inside, that realization was beginning to change him in ways he never expected. The next morning began like any other. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. Traffic hummed outside. Coffee brewed in the small kitchen while the city prepared for another busy day. Ava expected to find the stranger reading one of her books or standing quietly by the window. Instead, she found him frozen in front of the television. The news channel filled the screen. A breaking story banner stretched across the bottom. A photograph appeared beside the anchor. Ava stopped instantly. The coffee mug nearly slipped from her hand. The face on the television was the same face she had welcomed into her apartment. The same man who had slept on her couch. The same man who had eaten soup at her kitchen table and washed dishes beside her. The news anchor spoke with urgency. Ethan Carter, founder and chief executive officer of Carter Global Technologies, had reportedly disappeared from public view for nearly 2 days after leaving a private corporate event. Financial analysts, investors, and media outlets across the country were speculating about his whereabouts. Images flashed across the screen. Corporate headquarters, international conferences, magazine covers, charity galas. Ethan standing beside presidents, celebrities, and business leaders. The apartment suddenly felt very small. Ava stared at the television. Then she slowly turned toward the kitchen doorway. Ethan stood there holding a cup of coffee. He knew exactly what she had seen. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The silence carried a completely different weight now. Ava looked back at the television, then at him, then back again. "You are Ethan Carter?" she finally asked. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before nodding. "Yes." Ava sat down slowly. Her mind raced through every conversation they had shared, every question he had avoided, every answer that now made sense. The expensive suit, the guarded behavior, the mysterious phone calls he occasionally ignored. She had spent nearly 2 days helping one of the most recognizable business leaders in America without realizing it. Ethan carefully placed his coffee cup on the counter. "I wanted to tell you." Ava folded her arms. "When?" The question carried no anger, only disbelief. Ethan sighed. Several times. He walked toward the table and sat down across from her. For the first time since they met, There was no distance between his public identity and the person sitting in front of her. The truth is that I did not know how. Ava studied his face. He looked uncomfortable, not because he had been discovered, because he genuinely cared what she thought. That realization surprised her more than the news itself. Ethan glanced around the apartment. For 2 days nobody expected anything from me except honesty. He smiled faintly. That does not happen very often. Ava looked at the television again. Financial experts continued discussing stock prices and board meetings. Entire industries seemed concerned about a man who had spent the previous night eating homemade soup in Brooklyn. The contrast felt almost unreal. You could have stayed anywhere, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. I know. You could have called anyone. I know. Ava shook her head. Then why stay here? Ethan's answer came without hesitation. Because this was the first place that felt real. The room became quiet again. Outside, a siren echoed somewhere in the distance. A neighbor closed a car door. Life continued normally beyond the apartment walls. Yet inside, everything had changed. Ava now knew the truth about the stranger she had helped. And as she looked into Ethan Carter's eyes, she realized the biggest surprise was not that he was a billionaire. It was that beneath all the success, influence, and attention, he seemed just as grateful for kindness as anyone else. The rest of the morning passed more quietly than either of them expected. After the initial shock faded, Ava found herself asking questions she never imagined asking. Not about money, not about private jets or corporate headquarters. She wanted to understand the person behind the headlines. Ethan answered honestly, more honestly than he usually allowed himself to be. He told her how his company had started in a rented office barely larger than her living room. He described sleeping beside a desk during the early years because he could not afford an apartment close to work. He admitted that success had arrived gradually and then all at once. What surprised Ava most was how little he spoke about achievements. Instead, he talked about responsibility. Thousands of employees, countless decisions, endless expectations. Every day, people looked to him for answers. Every day, he worried about making the wrong choice. The image felt completely different from the confident executive she had seen on television. By early afternoon, Ethan's phone finally rang. He had ignored dozens of calls over the previous 2 days, but this time he answered. Ava could tell immediately that the conversation mattered. His posture changed. His expression became focused, professional, familiar. For several minutes, he listened carefully. Then he stood and walked toward the window. When the call ended, silence filled the apartment. Ethan stared outside for a long moment before turning around. Ava already knew what he was about to say. You have to go back, she said softly. Ethan nodded. Yes. The words seemed heavier than they should have been. He had built an empire. Yet leaving that apartment appeared more difficult than returning to it. Ava smiled gently. Your company probably misses you. Ethan laughed quietly. My board of directors definitely does. They spent the next hour talking one final time. Not as a billionaire and a waitress. Simply as two people whose lives had unexpectedly crossed paths. Ava shared more about her dream of opening a community cafe. Ethan listened carefully, asking questions about location, costs, and plans. His business instincts surfaced naturally. Before long, they were sketching ideas on a notepad at the kitchen table. The conversation felt effortless. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself discussing possibilities instead of quarterly reports. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the moment ended. A black vehicle stopped outside the building. Ava noticed it through the window first. Several professionally dressed individuals stepped onto the sidewalk. They looked relieved, anxious, grateful. Ethan glanced outside and released a slow breath. They found me. Ava folded the notepad and handed it back to him. Looks like your world caught up. Ethan smiled. The smile carried genuine affection now. Not romantic affection. Human affection. The kind that forms when someone sees you at your most vulnerable and chooses kindness anyway. A few minutes later, he stood near the apartment door holding his jacket. The small space suddenly felt different. Emptier somehow. Ava realized she had grown accustomed to his presence. Ethan looked around the apartment one final time. The bookshelves. The photographs. The tiny kitchen. The ordinary life that had reminded him who he used to be before success consumed every hour of every day. Thank you, he said quietly. Ava nodded. Take care of yourself. Ethan hesitated as though he wanted to say something more. Instead, he simply smiled and opened the door. Moments later, he disappeared down the hallway. Ava stood alone, listening to his footsteps fade into the distance. Then even those were gone. The apartment became silent. The stranger she had sheltered was gone. The billionaire had returned to his world. And despite everything they had shared, he left without promises, without grand gestures, and without any indication that she would ever see him again. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. Life returned to its familiar routine. Ava worked long shifts at the diner, attended online classes whenever she could, and continued building plans for a future that still felt distant. At first, she occasionally found herself wondering about Ethan, not because she expected anything, simply because the experience had been impossible to forget. Yet as the days turned into weeks, even those thoughts became less frequent. Billionaires belonged to a different world. Ava understood that. Their paths had crossed by accident. Real life had resumed. At least that was what she believed. On a cool Thursday afternoon, the diner was unusually busy. Office workers filled the booths. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Orders moved rapidly between the kitchen and dining area. Ava balanced a tray of drinks while weaving through crowded tables. It felt like every other shift. Then someone near the front window gasped. Another customer stood up. A cook emerged from the kitchen to see what everyone was staring at. Ava glanced outside and froze. A line of black luxury vehicles had just pulled up along the curb. Their polished surfaces reflected the afternoon sunlight. People on the sidewalk stopped walking. Several diners pressed closer to the windows. Nobody understood what was happening. The restaurant owner looked concerned. For a brief moment, Ava wondered if some celebrity had arrived. Then one of the rear doors opened. Ethan Carter stepped onto the sidewalk. The entire diner seemed to fall silent. Conversation stopped. Forks paused halfway to plates. Even the kitchen noise seemed quieter. Ethan looked exactly like the man she had seen on television. Tailored suit, confident posture, executive presence. Yet when he looked through the restaurant window and spotted Ava, something warmer appeared in his expression. Recognition, gratitude. The restaurant owner hurried toward the entrance, clearly nervous. Before he could reach the door, Ethan was already inside. Several customers immediately reached for their phones. Others whispered among themselves. Ava remained standing beside her table, completely stunned. Ethan walked directly toward her. No hesitation. No assistant speaking for him. No layers of formality. Just Ethan. When he reached the table, he smiled. "Hello, Ava." The simple greeting somehow felt more surprising than the motorcade outside. Ava blinked. "You came back." Ethan laughed softly. "I told myself I was too busy." He glanced around the diner. "Turns out I was wrong." The owner of the restaurant looked as though he might faint from excitement. Employees stared openly. Customers whispered questions to one another. Yet Ethan seemed completely uninterested in the attention. His focus remained on Ava. "Can you take a break?" he asked. 20 minutes later, they sat at a quiet table near the back of the restaurant. Ethan listened while Ava described the past few weeks. School assignments, rent increases, exhausting shifts, the ordinary challenges of ordinary life. He paid attention to every detail. Then he placed a folder on the table between them. Ava looked at it cautiously. "What is this?" Ethan leaned back slightly. "Not a gift." Ava narrowed her eyes. "That sounds exactly like something that is a gift." Ethan smiled. "It is an opportunity." Ava slowly opened the folder. Her eyes moved across the pages, then widened. Business plans, financial projections, property research, community development studies. Every idea she had casually mentioned during their conversations had somehow become the foundation of something real. For the second time since meeting Ethan Carter, Ava found herself completely speechless. For several moments, Ava could do nothing except stare at the documents in front of her. The folder contained far more than an idea. It contained research, location options, financial models, community outreach plans, and educational partnerships. Every page reflected months of work. Every detail connected to the dream she had described so casually at her kitchen table. A dream she had always treated as something distant. Something that might happen someday if life became easier. Slowly, she looked up at Ethan. "You did all this?" Ethan nodded. "Not alone. I had help." Ava shook her head in disbelief. "Why?" The question carried genuine confusion. Ethan leaned forward slightly. The busy diner around them seemed to fade into the background. "Because you reminded me of something I forgot." Ava remained silent. Ethan glanced around the restaurant before continuing. For years, I believed success meant building bigger companies, earning more recognition, solving larger problems. He smiled faintly. Then I spent 2 days in a small apartment with someone who had every reason to think about herself and chose kindness instead. Ava lowered her eyes. The compliment made her uncomfortable. Ethan noticed. You gave shelter to a stranger when nobody else stopped. You expected nothing in return. That matters more than you realize. The words settled between them. Not because they sounded dramatic. Because they sounded sincere. Ava looked through the folder again. One page described a community cafe and learning center. Another outlined scholarship opportunities. Another detailed mentorship programs for local students. The vision was larger than anything she had imagined on her own. Yet somehow it still felt like hers. This is too much, she whispered. Ethan immediately shook his head. No. His voice remained calm. It is exactly enough. He pointed toward the plans. I am not giving you a business. I am giving you a chance to build the one you already dreamed about. Ava felt emotion rising unexpectedly. For years, she had worked double shifts, postponed goals, and convinced herself that waiting was practical, necessary, safe. Now someone was looking directly at her potential instead of her circumstances. Few people had ever done that. Ethan stood and walked toward the restaurant window. Outside, pedestrians continued moving along the sidewalk. Cars passed through the intersection. The city carried on as if nothing extraordinary was happening. When I stayed at your apartment, he said quietly, I saw something I had not seen in a long time. Ava joined him near the window. What? Ethan smiled. A future that was not measured by numbers. The answer lingered in the air. After a moment, Ava laughed softly through the emotion in her voice. You know, most people would have just sent flowers. Ethan laughed too. I considered it. The sound eased the tension between them. For the first time since his arrival, everything felt simple again. Not billionaire and waitress. Not wealth and struggle. Just two people whose lives had changed each other in unexpected ways. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off nearby buildings. Inside, the folder remained open on the table, full of possibilities, full of hope. Ethan eventually glanced at his watch and knew it was time to leave. Meetings, responsibilities, and obligations were waiting. Yet before he walked away, he turned back toward Ava one final time. The world notices success, he said, but it is kindness that changes lives. Ava watched him leave the diner and step into the waiting vehicle outside. This time, however, she did not feel as though something was ending. She felt as though something was finally beginning. The stranger she had welcomed during a storm had returned her greatest gift. Not money, not status, not attention. He had returned belief. And sometimes belief is the one thing a dream needs to become real.